The story of lost papyri in ancient Egypt is not merely a tale of missing documents. It is the story of an entire intellectual universe that once existed in extraordinary richness and complexity, and that has since faded into fragments and echoes. Along the Nile Valley, writing was not an occasional tool, but a foundational pillar of civilization. From the Old Kingdom onward, Egypt developed a highly sophisticated scribal culture in which trained elites documented religious rituals, royal decrees, scientific observations, economic transactions, literary compositions, and philosophical reflections. The medium that carried all of this, papyrus, was itself both ingenious and tragically vulnerable. Crafted from the pith of the Nile reed, it enabled portability, standardization, and mass production of texts, yet it was highly susceptible to moisture, decay, and physical damage. Only in the arid deserts of Upper Egypt did papyri stand a chance of surviving for millennia. Everywhere else, especially in densely populated humid or coastal regions, countless manuscripts simply disintegrated over time. What this means is profound. The corpus of ancient Egyptian texts we possess today is not representative of what once existed, but rather a narrow, accidental survival shaped by environmental luck and historical circumstance. Every preserved document is, in effect, a survivor of an immense, largely vanished archive. What remains reveals just enough to hint at what has been lost. Texts like the Book of the Dead are not singular works, but evolving collections of spells, prayers, and theological formulations, copied and adapted over centuries. No two versions are identical, and no definitive, complete version exists. This variability suggests that Egyptian religious thought was far more dynamic and locally interpreted than a single standardized canon would imply. Yet even within this diversity we encounter gaps, missing spells, broken sequences, references to rituals that no longer survive. These absences are not trivial. They indicate that entire strands of theological development have disappeared. Similarly, surviving medical texts such as the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus demonstrate a level of empirical observation and procedural logic that challenges older assumptions about ancient medicine. They describe diagnoses, prognoses, and treatments with surprising precision. Yet scholars widely agree that these texts are themselves copies of earlier works, likely drawn from a broader corpus of medical knowledge that has not survived. The implication is striking. What we see as impressive may only be a fraction of a much more advanced and systematic tradition of Egyptian science. Beyond religious and scientific texts, there once existed a vast body of historical writing that has largely vanished. The fragments we possess, such as damaged king lists or partial administrative records, suggest that Egypt maintained continuous documentation of its political and social life. However, the detailed narratives that would have accompanied these records, accounts of military campaigns, diplomatic exchanges, internal governance, and societal change, are almost entirely lost. This absence is not due to a lack of documentation, but to the disappearance of the documents themselves. In some cases, we can detect the shadows of these lost works through later references or inscriptions that allude to earlier records. In others, the silence is complete. The administrative papyri that once tracked taxation, labor organization, construction logistics, and trade networks were produced in enormous quantities, yet most were discarded, recycled, or destroyed after their immediate use. Only exceptional sites, such as desert worker settlements, have yielded partial archives, and even these represent a minute fraction of what once existed. The daily functioning of one of history's most complex civilizations is therefore known to us only in outline, with the fine details irretrievably gone. The loss becomes even more dramatic when we consider centers of knowledge accumulation, such as the Alexandria Library. Established during the Hellenistic period, this institution sought to gather all known texts, including Egyptian works that may have been copied, translated, or preserved within its collections. It functioned not only as a repository, but as a hub of scholarship where texts were studied, compared, and expanded upon. Its eventual destruction represents one of the greatest intellectual losses in human history. The papyri housed there likely included works that existed nowhere else, including Egyptian religious treatises, scientific studies, and historical chronicles that were never duplicated beyond the library's walls. The loss of Alexandria is therefore not just the loss of Greek or Hellenistic knowledge, but also the disappearance of Egyptian texts that had been preserved or transformed within that cosmopolitan environment. It is a reminder that preservation is not merely about creation, but about transmission, and when transmission fails, even the most advanced knowledge can vanish. Layered onto this historical reality is a more symbolic dimension of loss, reflected in ancient traditions themselves. Egyptian culture, along with later Hellenistic interpretations, preserved the idea of sacred writings attributed to Thoth, the divine scribe and patron of knowledge. These texts, sometimes referred to as the Book of Thoth, were said to contain profound insights into the nature of the cosmos, language, and divine power. In later traditions associated with Hermes Trismegistus, these writings became part of a broader corpus of esoteric wisdom. Whether these texts existed as specific physical papyri or represent an idealized memory of lost knowledge is a matter of debate, but their cultural significance is clear. They reflect an awareness, even in antiquity, that knowledge could be lost, hidden, or inaccessible. In this sense, the myth of lost divine texts mirrors the historical reality of vanished papyri. It suggests that the Egyptians and their intellectual successors were themselves conscious of gaps in their own tradition, aware that what they possessed was incomplete. The cumulative effect of these losses is profound. Yet behind these fragments lies a far more extensive and interconnected system of knowledge that we can only partially glimpse. The philosophical reflections embedded in wisdom literature, the technical precision of medical and mathematical texts, the narrative richness of literary compositions, and the administrative complexity of bureaucratic records all point to a civilization of remarkable intellectual depth. And yet, for every text we can read, there may have been dozens or hundreds that are gone. Entire genres may have existed that we do not even know to look for. Entire schools of thought may have flourished and disappeared without leaving a trace. This creates a paradox. Ancient Egypt is one of the most documented civilizations of the ancient world, and yet its documentation is profoundly incomplete. In the end, the lost papyri of Egypt remind us that history is not only what survives, but also what has been erased. The silence between the fragments is as important as the fragments themselves. Each missing scroll, each broken line, each reference to an unknown text represents a boundary beyond which our knowledge cannot pass. And yet, within that boundary lies the possibility of a much richer understanding of human thought, creativity, and inquiry, one that we can only imagine, reconstruct in part, and continue to seek through the careful study of what remains. The story of lost papyri in ancient Egypt is not merely a tale of missing documents. It is the story of an entire intellectual universe that once existed in extraordinary richness and complexity, and that has since faded into fragments and echoes.